What do you do with your personal portfolio? Are you as wild and aggressive as Bill with his holy trinity of three investments and margin, or are you a little more conservative?
I'm mostly invested in our funds, and I have a handful of stocks, and a little bit of Bitcoin. I don't do the same leverage thing that Bill. That I also don't have access to the same margin rates that Bill has historically had access to, and I just, you know, one of my things is, I just don't want to ever deal with being a forced seller. So I have a little bit of margin, which I put on in this market in particular, with higher yielding stuff that could, more than pay the rate. So, and then the securities I own outside are mostly, older legacy things, and they're names that we own, in the funds too. So names like Amazon or One Main Financial or Farfetch or some of the banks, those sort of things.
You mentioned your three children, and so what? They're between 12 and 4, did you say?
4, 9, and 11.
Okay. Um, I'm just wondering, like, how you handle the intensity of parenting, family life. I know you mentioned before we started talking that your husband is a teacher in a nearby school. So obviously, you're not doing all of this alone, but still, it's incredibly difficult given how intense the work is and how super competitive. How do you just manage in practical terms to juggle this stuff?
Well, I am fortunate to have a lot of help at home. So my husband's a teacher, next year all three will be at the same school where he is. That's a huge help. I'm super, fortunate. I have more help at home. So I feel very fortunate to have that sort of help, but it still is challenging because they are, my most important priority. And so I want to make time and space for them. And so I am pretty maniacal about my time and trying to only spend my time on the most important things and trying to say no to everything else. And fortunately, I'm I don't know if this is fortunate, but I'm pretty introverted. And so I don't have a need for, a big social calendar. I am just fine spending zero time on that. I do spend some time doing some charitable stuff. I have a great team, at the office and spend very little time on anything organizational. So it's really, I try to spend most of my time, during the day on investment stuff. And then we'll have a family dinner together. We try to do that every night. I travel sometimes, so we can't do that every night, but that's our, time to be together. And really now with, remote work, it makes things, so much more efficient. And so I can meet with a lot of companies on Zoom and have to travel a lot less to do that, which is, a huge benefit. And so I can sneak out to a game once in a while, though my kids tell me I don't attend enough of their stuff. So it's always I don't have this totally figured out. It's like I'm either missing something here or missing something there, but that's the sort of, I think Jeff Bezos says he doesn't like the word balance. It's more about harmony. So again, can I just make everything sort of work harmoniously and fulfill all my obligations? That's sort of, I'm like, if everyone's a little bit upset that I'm not doing it, I'm probably balancing it, pretty well.
Tony Robbins once, I don't think he said this to me. I think he said it to Peter Diamandis, who then said it to me, that Tony says it's not about work-life balance, it's about work-play integration. I thought that's a really interesting insight that you'd never really get work-life balance, but it is possible to have some degree of work-play integration where and I don't know, this has always eluded me, and I'm very struck when I see a lot of the great investors at the sacrifices they've had to make. And I remember Jean-Marie Eveillard telling me once, saying that he felt like he'd neglected his daughters a bit. And he said, yeah, I asked him if you had been a less neglectful father, would your returns have been as good? And he said, I don't know. I really don't know. I thought that was a very interesting admission.
I I think that's part of what I struggled with because I knew I never wanted to make that mistake. As
Mhm.
soon as I had a child, I was, changed and I had such love for this thing and I wanted to, be with her all the time at the beginning. And so that's part of what led me to have those questions at the beginning. And Bill had always said, about Peter Lynch that he had left the business. And again, this is where I feel so fortunate to be doing this now. He said there you can only be in two modes, overdrive or stop. And then I remember hearing the story about how Peter never took a vacation. His entire career, he took one vacation. And when he went away, the markets were crashing. He was on the phone. I think he had to fly. I think he was overseas. He had to fly back to the office. He never took another one. And so, that's amazing. I probably wouldn't have been able to do this if I wouldn't have wanted to make that choice if I had done this, 20 or 30 years ago when those were the options. I mean, now we have Bloomberg on phones. So again, I'm a phone addict. My kids will tell you I'm on it all the time. We try to put it down at dinner and not pick it up. So we have spaces where it's not, but I can be on top of what's going on in the markets and still, duck out for something. And then if I know if an emergency is going on or, the tools we have today, I think make that integration, which is actually something I was horrible at earlier in my career. And it didn't really matter, then as much as it would matter now. I would have had to figure that out of like a work life. And I was in the office all the time when I was younger. And so before I had a family, I was fine. That was like my preferred lifestyle. And then when I had kids, everything changed. And so it became much more important to figure out how do I integrate this? How do I stay on top of all my responsibilities. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I try to make all of my home responsibilities. I can't do this completely, but I try revolving around my children and not a lot of the, home things. And again, not everyone can, do that and has that privilege. I understand that, but I feel very, very fortunate, to have a very good situation with that.
You've mentioned before that I think less than 10% of all fund managers are women. And I know that as you were coming into the job, you were reading books on leadership by people like Ray Dalio, and you'd mentioned a book by Colin Powell, I think his biography. So you were studying leadership. And I'm wondering what you've thought about the type of leader you want to be, and as you assume the leadership position in the firm, and what kind of leader you want to be in order to be a role model to other women and to your own children.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that's still a work in process. I think I'm a slow learner. I like a lot of time. It's the evidentiary threshold thing again that Bill says. Like I like to, really study things, spend a lot of time, get a lot of data. So I was very explicit about reading about that. And really before that, I didn't have any organizational responsibility. So it was all investing. And that suited me just perfectly. I like to sit at my computer and be by myself and read and do research and build models. And so it's a whole new challenge and one that I find very exciting, but that I had to, figure out. I knew I was not like Bill. And so I oftentimes compare myself to Bill. And this was an area where we are not alike. And so I had to find, my own voice. And I know that I'm very passionate about women and, women having, equal opportunities and women having the confidence. I think some of the stats of women are that, at least in investing, they just don't have the confidence that men have. And actually that can help their results in performance because, they don't trade as much. But I think they're just as well suited to invest if they so choose and may have many benefits. So I think helping them understand it and that educational aspect, and I'm passionate about that. And we're building up the team and capabilities. I think that'll be an important part of the approach. I mean, more broadly, just helping people invest better and, hopefully being a voice that can help people make better decisions as we go, forward, will be important in patients' future. In terms of leadership, I think, as I've read about these service leaders, that resonates with me well in terms of the sort of leaders who want to help their people accomplish their objectives. One of the things I loved about working with Bill and we worked so well together is I always loved the feeling of, helping this, great master accomplish these, great things and growing on my own as a part of that. But I realize I find a lot of fulfillment in that. So you don't just have to do that to people you report to. You can also do that to people, who work for you. And so the big challenge that I'm still working through is making sure you have the right time and space and efficiently, how do you most efficiently do that and figure out the scale and leverage to do that. So, but that's what I think about, if I'm really inspired by helping people, I've learned about myself. So if it's help, that also abstracts away from, it's not just about the numbers, although what I love about this business is at the end of the day, it is about the numbers. So you can either do it or not. You need a long time horizon to assess that. But you can help people, in many other ways to make good investment decisions. I think you do great work there. That's, I find your work so inspiring. So I think you're helping people do that. And I would like to, do that as well.
I asked Bill a couple of weeks ago how you were different from him, and one thing he mentioned that I thought was really interesting was he said that he said, look, I could look at 8 people's portfolios and I'd be able to tell you who they belong to. And so he said there are certain things about your portfolio that are distinctive. And one of the things that he said is that you like to invest in companies run by women, and one of the reasons for that is that they tend to be underestimated. And I was saying to that to my wife this morning, and I was like, it's so true. And she's like, yeah, absolutely. I mean, can you talk a bit about that? I thought it was such an interesting observation. Men suffer from so much overconfidence in so many ways. And I mean, these are absurd generalizations, but also there's something to them, I think.
It's so funny. That you asked Bill that. I wouldn't have guessed that he would have said that. I haven't had that conversation with him. So it's really interesting. So there's a number of different things here. One, yes, I think it's completely true. And Bill's explicitly talked about it. I think, women are underestimated. And some of my favorite stats, again, I don't know the veracity of this, but I've heard this stat where, it was at some women's conference I was listening to, and they said, if you ask, a woman or a group of women, how much do you need to know about a topic to raise your hand and say, yeah, I know about that. I'm expert at that. Or even I'm well equipped to answer that. They said it's like 90%. They need to have covered the whole landscape and know a lot about it. And with men, it's more like 30%. They're like, have I read a few things? Have I ever been exposed to this? Oh yeah, I know something about it. Again, I don't know if that's true. I have not found this study, but you can see some areas in life, like with my 2 kids, they were asking me about Santa Claus real. And my daughter, who's older, she was like, I don't know. I mean, this. I don't think you guys really, know what I like. And my son was just like, he's not. And I'm like, how do you know? And he's like, I just know he's not. He was entirely confident of he did not have more information. He wasn't thinking, but again, that's an anecdote, but it's a fun one.
It has a low evidentiary threshold.
Yeah. So I do think, I do think it's true. And, but it's not a search strategy. I don't go searching for women CEOs. They make up a greater percentage of the portfolio. And I do agree that I think they're, underestimated, or maybe expectations are low. But I also think that's the value of diversity. And Bill was really early on the values of diversity on the team, is that, women just happen to, we're different in some ways. And the stuff that I look at, I end up finding things, more things that are, run by women. And so, or what they say resonates with me in a different way. And then I do more work on the stock and the company. So it is, I do think we overrepresent on women CEOs relative to the market overall. I did look into that. And maybe I should make it a search strategy. I haven't done that so far. I think it just is the value of diversity and people from different backgrounds, or, that have different characteristics, have a different life, and they find different things.
It's interesting. It sounds like a weird digression, but I was just thinking back to my interview with Fred Martin on the podcast. And this isn't something that came up in the podcast itself, but it came up in my research before it, where he had said to me years ago that when he's looking to hire someone, he finds serious underdogs. and he had hired these people who were really hungry. They tended to be minorities, foreigners who come from poor backgrounds and were really smart and really driven. And I think in general, finding people who underrepresented in some way and hungry and overlooked, it's powerful in every area, whether it's hiring or investing.
Yes, definitely. And I think the other interesting thing is, Danny Kahneman's done work on confidence and how confidence is the key thing that convinces people of things. And so, there's a lot of good data and evidence on men having more confidence over, the data that I've seen is trading and, overconfidence is related to that. So that's where we do have, better data. But I think that confidence really helps you sell yourself. And I know plenty of women who undersell themselves. And, one of my friends who works at a big company and, she does PowerPoints all the time. And she was applying for this other job and it asked her to rate how she would rate herself on PowerPoints. And she gave herself like a mediocre grade. And her boss came into her and said, "What are you doing? You do PowerPoints every day. Like, no one does them more than you. Like, what more do you expect to know? Go change that and rate yourself higher." And so, and I've heard, some people in the asset allocation world talk about this as it relates to investors and advise women to present themselves differently in a more confident manner. Again, I'm not sure I agree that that's the optimal solution to that problem, but I do think that, again, if there is some difference there, my guess would most women who make it to the CEO level are, most confident end of the spectrum of women. So, but if there is some, lower confidence, lower, presentation that leads into how they're being perceived by the world and lowers those expectations. Again, low expectations, I think are always helpful when it comes to investing.
You also shared a really interesting thing on Twitter some time ago. That was an article from the New York Times, I think, where they were writing about a study that Fidelity had done of something like 5 million or so customer accounts between like 2011 and 2020. So it's quite a significant study. And they found that their female customers earned, I think, 0.4 percentage points a year more than their male customers on average. That's really striking. I mean, what's going on there that women do
Yeah,
sort of have better judgment?
There is broad, again, all of the data I've seen, on that sort of thing is similar. And it's that women do a little better because they trade less. Again, they just trade less. So men trade more. They're more confident. They think, and they must be doing the right. So if something's down, they sell it, they buy something out, they're obviously trading in a way but there's a lot of good evidence that, doing less helps returns, there's costs to doing that. So, again, I think, I love that data on the returns, but I think it relates to that, overconfidence piece.
Yeah, it's humbling for us men. I definitely feel like I suffer from overconfidence a lot of the time. I'm proof of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So I wanted to just ask you one last question, because I'm aware that I'm exhausting your patience and you have better time management skills than I do, so you probably have to go somewhere. I wanted to ask you, in when you look back on your investing career and think of all the stuff that you've learned from working with Bill or from your own experience of dealing with all of these tumultuous periods and how they've ended up turning out right in the end, are there lessons that you've drawn that you've tried to pass on to your three kids, because they apply not just in investing but are really important life lessons that you can carry from your investment career into life, that are sort of important things for young kids to internalize?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a great question. There are so many overlaps. I think, just the power of time and more the stuff that we talked about on stoicism and the power of the mind. For my daughter specifically, the confidence stuff, again, my 4-year-old's too young, but my 11-year-old, I try to teach her, that sort of stuff. But I think I shared with them, some of the story about Arnold and his history. And it was just so striking that you can go through such horrible, times and then, will yourself to be better. I think it was really transformative to my kids. My son last year, had a ruptured appendix, and then he had all these complications, abscesses, and it was really, jarring for him to, and it made him much more fearful, I think, about his health. And so, we talked a lot about mantras and, repeating things and the power and how your body can heal itself. And he's really probably internalized the most the power that the mind can have. I mean, I'm always trying to come home and share with them little lessons that I learned, in the day. And I think, one of those things, I mean, there's so many things we could go on forever, but one of the first lessons Bill taught was, to go directly to the source if you get information. And that was, in 2002, 2003. Today, misinformation is, an even greater thing. And for my kids who are growing up in an age of the internet and social media and the amount of it out there, I'm constantly telling them to look for credible sources, go directly to the source, look for information in different areas that can confirm your understanding of something. Again, this triangulate view. I think that's so important in today's day and age. So I talk about that a lot, to be based on the evidence and inform your view before having a position on something. Again, the power of the mind and mantras and, how powerful that can be. I've taught them little tools that, they'll use from time to time. So yeah, I think there's a lot of, things that you learn as you're in this line of work that can be helpful far more broadly.
What would be a typical tool that you taught them, like a mantra or something?
Well, we do mantra. So, my son, after that, my body can heal my body was like his mantra.
I love it.
And he would say it in a funny way. And if he starts, like, he says it and it really helped him. And it helped him believe. And he had this complication where, again, he was at risk for another surgery and it's not clear that it's entirely healed. So he continued to tell himself that. And it was really, I think it's helped him. And then I don't know if you've heard of this neuro-emotional technique. So there's a practitioner, that I see locally who's pretty advanced in this neuro-emotional technique. And, and I love her and I love this technique. But the body can tell, she can tell by doing different things in the body, like moving your fingers. If it weakens to certain things, you have these neural networks in the brain. If you have an emotional belief state that's not helping you, it's a way of trying to figure out, what is that belief state? And then, through some breathing and feeling and kind of going into that feeling, working through it and letting it pass through you. And so it's much better when it's done by a practitioner, but you can, do it a little bit on yourself. And so, at least I've tried that and I've taught my kids to do that. And I think it's quite helpful, for them. So if they're feeling scared, if they're feeling scared, Mom, I'm feeling scared. I think someone's going to break in my room at night. And, everything I tell them, well, that's not going to happen. Here's all the reason, all the rational reasons why that's not moving to them. But if they, you kind of put your hand on your forehead and hold your wrist and you close your eyes and you go into that feeling and you just stay there until the feeling passes. And then you take a couple of deep breaths and then you can, test and see if you're still weakening to that thought. And so it's just a technique to use in the moment when you're having points of stress or worry or concern, to really feel those and allow them, allow yourself to work through them, which I think is a super helpful tool. I think they've both found, again, I haven't done it with my youngest. It's a little trickier with her, but my older kids, I think, have found it quite helpful. I find that, quite helpful as well. And some people have likened the technique more broadly. My practitioner has likened it, you can go to a therapy session and you can talk for an hour about, what's bothering you or try to get to that and then work through it that way. This is a really efficient way to let the body diagnose it. Or if you know something, you can go directly to it that way too. And then it takes, again, a few minutes, to clear it. And maybe you need to do a few rounds of this, but it's a highly efficient way to process some of that stuff.
And is there a good resource for people if they want to go to a website or a book or anything like that for them to learn more about this?
There is a website. There's a neuro-emotional technique website, and it has practitioners. So you can search your local area for, it has both information and practitioners. I don't know if there's a good book more more broadly. I'm sure there is. I haven't, read one, but there's a lot of good information on the website.
I don't know if it's, and we'll include that in the show notes for the episode. I don't know if it's relevant. It sounds related, but there's a lovely book by co-written by Kristen Neff, who's a great psychologist at the University of Texas, I think in Austin, and she's a Buddhist meditation practitioner, but also a psychologist or an academic who's an expert on the brain and the like. And she co-wrote a great book called the Self-Compassion Workbook. And there's something really interesting in there where she talks about different ways of soothing yourself by, touching your hands, touching your face, things like that. And I remember her saying that there's one point where she's talking about some technique and she says, this works for about 50% of people. And it was really interesting that, for some people rubbing their arm is going to help them. And for some people putting their hand on their face is going to help them. But it was really interesting to me that the way you talk to yourself, the way you put your hand on your face or whatever would have huge benefits. And she's just looked really deeply into the scientific arguments for self-compassion rather than beating yourself up, which is the approved technique of kids who go to English boarding schools.
Yes. I was raised in a Catholic school, so I am well versed in that. And so, those of us who are in that environment, it takes us many years to work out of it. I think that's interesting. I haven't heard about that, but there's a lot of these interesting modalities. I've read about tapping, and I know, a number of smart health practitioners have said some benefit to like tapping on different parts of your face while repeating some of these mantras and how powerful it is. It's an interesting, I love stats, so that it works for 50%. I'd love to have more of that on these different things in terms of, but I think most of them are pretty evidence-based that I've seen in terms of, good data to support that. Again, working through a lot of these things can be they're far more physical than I would have expected, when I started learning about this stuff.
That's what's great when you study people like Dan Goleman, who has a PhD in psychology from Harvard and is an expert on the neuroscience of meditation, or Kristen Neff, who's not only a serious meditator, but also an expert on the science of self-compassion. And so you look at this stuff, and you're like, this isn't just, ancient wisdom that's been tested for 2,000 years, which is pretty good. But it's actually, now they're able to show that these things work, which I think is interesting. So it gives you kind of hope that within the maelstrom of investing and life and parenting and all of these things, you can gain more control over your state of mind, your equanimity, so it's hopeful, but it also gives you a sense of how important it is that if you want to have a full and happy and truly abundant life, it's not just about getting amazing returns. You actually kind of want to have peace of mind. And that, I think that's one of the things I've most admired about Bill over all these years is that, when I was younger, I thought, God, he's just got the most beautiful mind. He's got this really thrilling intellect. And it kind of bowled me over. I would always be very excited after I finished an interview with him. I would come away sort of on an intellectual and emotional high. And increasingly, when I look back, I'm more and more admiring of the fact that he showed such resilience and sort of sense of honor and good humor when he had I can't swear on this podcast apparently, but when he had things kicked out of him, and then managed to come back from it. And that seems to me such an extraordinary thing. And when you wrote the thank you letter to Bill that I read recently, you talked about the power of resilience and perseverance and the importance of positivity and a great sense of humor. And so it's interesting, like there were really personal qualities that we admire. You weren't mentioning just his brilliance. It was like his character and his ethics and resilience. So it seems central to me, really.